Well, good afternoon. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Mary-Eve. I was thinking, has it really been 10 years? I think it has. I actually heard that the other speaker claimed that I was, that he had just Googled something and that I was a real academic and I was going to give you the real, I don't know what, citations or something. I hope I managed to satisfy that requirement for you. What I do want to do before I begin, though, is thank the conference for inviting me to come here and speak with you. I do tend to focus a little bit more on academic contexts, and I'm really struggling to bridge out into industry and figure out ways that the kind of work that I do can actually help satisfy the kind of jobs that many of you are engaged in. So I appreciate this opportunity to speak. And what I really want to talk about today is not exactly a critique of design thinking, as much as it is an attempt to think a little bit about some of the limitations of that term, not limitations in the concept of it, but limitations in the application of it. I don't actually believe that design thinking is Oh, sorry, how do I advance the slides? I need to use the, sorry, I'm used to using my own computer to do this kind of work. There we go, now I'm in the right place here. So what I want to talk with you is not necessarily a critique of design thinking as much as it is a kind of an attempt to see how we can supplement it or kind of provide an antidote to some of the kind of issues that might be associated with it. Design thinking, of course, as you all know, is a great tool for contextualizing design, speaking about design to multiple stakeholders, looping people into a more human-centered design process. My issue with it tends to be when it is used in a more linear, procedural way, when it's utilized as a way of de-skilling designers in favor of more abstract kinds of modes of work. And what I want to talk about really is how the kind of work I generally call critical making, which emphasizes the situated, context-specific, and material nature of design, can provide an antidote to some of the potential dangers of a linear design thinking modality. So I don't want to just critique design thinking. This is actually a recent post from Cameron Tonkinwise. Many of you may know Cameron. With a wonderful link to a video that was posted by William Gibson of this amazing art exhibit happening in New York right now that literally looks like a kind of an explosion of Post-it notes. And I think we're used to thinking about that critique of design thinking, this kind of Post-it note-y, affinity mapping kind of activity that is often very reductive, is sometimes instrumentalized, and sort of ends up focusing the design work into a automatable, trackable, state-based kind of phenomenon. And when I started to think about those aspects, it started to remind me a little bit of the time motion studies that occurred around the turn of the century, carried out by people like Frederick Taylor or the Gilbreths. There was something, not in the concept of design thinking, but in its application that seemed to mirror the kind of segmentation and reduction of human labor that's often been part of capital expansion into new forms of work and expertise. And this way in which, so you can see up here a seamstress, I think, who is working, and some bricklayers that are being recorded and timed. This kind of way in which this complex, embodied form of labor gets segmented and converted into a stepwise process, this kind of linear transformation of an open-ended creative practice is, I think, the thing to worry a little bit about in regards to design thinking. And the goals, I think, of bringing design thinking, of turning design thinking into that kind of procedural process is very similar to the goals of the Taylors and the Gilbreths as well. It was they, in the turn of the century, were trying to make labor more tractable, make it more explicit, make it more understandable even to systems of management. But it was also an attempt to reduce inefficient labor. It was an attempt to reduce, in fact, what the Gilbreths called wasted motion. And one of the major attempts, and it's represented here by this kind of blurry picture I pulled in, of a couple of guys with their clipboards observing the skilled machinist on one side. Part of the goal of that work was to increase oversight, to get more control over the laborer, and ultimately to reduce skilled and embodied labor into a kind of unskilled set of rote motions. And again, this is the kind of issue that I see that with certain applications of design thinking. So this problem of, motion all over the place, this kind of all over the place wasted motion was what the Gilbreths and the Taylors were trying to solve. And again, I think there are some parallels to some of the ways in which design thinking has been applied. By the way, these are the Gilbreths here, looking very seriously at us. And I think it's a bridge too far to say that design thinking is essentially about efficiency or essentially about reduction. But it is clear that many of the moves associated with it, the kind of set procedures, stepwise processes, explicit stages, as positive as they are, as useful as they can be, can have a bit of a tendency to reduce and ignore the complexity and indeterminacy of design work. So while on one hand, these kinds of processes can help us communicate to stakeholders what we're doing, looping human-centered design into the equation, communicating the value add that design might bring to an organization, there's also this risk that they also help de-skill the more embodied and creative aspects of design. So that's one thing that I wanted to highlight. The other thing that I personally have a bit of an issue with in terms of how design thinking is often applied is the way in which a strange immateriality seems to come to the fore when we start thinking about design thinking. I think it's that emphasis on that thinking part, maybe. There's a kind of a swapping in of linguistic artifacts, of words as replacements for the intractability of material systems. It's very symbolic, right? There's words, there's maps, there's diagrams, and these are all really important and necessary tools, of course. These are great ways to represent and make understandable the world. But my worry is often that they leave out the complexity of the real world. They leave out the ways in which the world can push back on us, the ways in which material systems, when we engage with them more directly, can in a sense, get beyond our ability to control them. So words, in a sense, don't push back on us in the same way that actual systems do, and this is another problem I see with design thinking, or I should say with particular instantiations of design thinking. So my work starts from a bit of a different origin. It starts from a kind of a commitment to a more reflexive material practice. And these are really activities that, and for good or for ill, really attempt to not reduce wasted motion. Remember that concept, you can see oops, my slide is missing here. The kind of wasted motion of the labor happening behind this slide. My work doesn't attempt to reduce that motion or to make that motion more efficient. Instead, I see a kind of a curated engagement with material systems as a means to recover the kind of creative embodied work that is part of design as well. So I'm not going to spend the rest of my time digging in more deeply to design thinking as it is procedurally carried out. But I want to describe my own kind of practice and try to surface for you how I think it operates as an antidote, not an anecdote, but an antidote or a corrective to some of these kinds of issues that I've just mentioned. And then I also want to talk a little bit at the end about why and how I think this links into service design as well. How many of you guys know this picture? See, okay, a smattering there. So this is Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby's teddy bear blood bag. And I use it here as an example for the ways in which design can provide tools for imagining alternative realities. So this is not necessarily the same way that design as a term gets used. But it's this kind of critical design work that I also seek to leverage. Design as a form of aesthetic intervention that creates new ways of thinking, denaturalizes assumptions, engenders a sense of cognitive dissonance. I think this is a great example of that kind of cognitive dissonance, and works to change minds or change our understandings of things in ways that argument and debate often struggle to do. Here's another example. How many people are familiar with this artifact? Julian Oliver's transparency grenade. So we've got Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby's great teddy bear blood bag. We've got Julian Oliver's transparency grenade. The blood bag is a commentary or a kind of an attempt to evoke some kind of engagement with questions of youth and healthcare. The transparency grenade is an attempt to instantiate a kind of an alternative to current modes of corporate transparency. These are beautiful objects. Unfortunately, my stuff isn't so beautiful. The activities that I tend to engage in what I call critical making do not result necessarily in these wonderful aesthetic objects that you saw before you. I wish they could, but that's not what I do. Instead, the kind of critical making work I do is about the process. It's about what people learn in the act of making. It's not about the results or about the production of didactic objects that are intended to convince and communicate to other people. So to give you a sense of what some of those projects have looked like, this is actually part of the instruction manual for drag racing packets, a project I did with legal scholars and students to explore questions of net neutrality from a more material and embodied phenomenon. Those were actually packets that people built and raced on a kind of a provisioned network. Other projects have included the 3D printing of guns as part of an ongoing conversation on gun legislation in the US and Canada. This is an aesthetic object, but only because the Globe and Mail photographer who took that picture made it such. And then projects where we made secret handshake gloves out of dollar store gloves and paper clips and LEDs and other things to basically build alternative worlds where digital technologies change how we communicate and relate to other people. So these were all projects that it's actually kind of hard for me to find pictures of, because the results, the end of these projects is not in fact what the objective was. Instead, it was about the process. Now, I bring this slide in here not because of necessarily the text on it, but as a placeholder for what I'd really like to say, which is that since 2007, as Mary-Eve noted, I've done about 80 workshops covering a range of themes, all of which were focused on exploring questions of socio-technical systems. We've focused on social media, 3D printing, medical technology, disability, aging, tagging, all sorts of different types of behaviors. And I have to say, I don't actually have a lot of good pictures of these things, which is sort of interesting. I have pictures like this, which is, I guess, sort of an aesthetic picture, but not as good as one would want. Now, I actually want to, before I move on, I think that the practice that I do is very limited. And in fact, has not had the kind of impact that I wanted to have, and I've been writing a little bit more about that in the past. In fact, I think design thinking, with its emphasis on pragmatic intervention into the world, the looping in of a more human-centered process, the incorporation and use of ethnographic and anthropological data, has been a very positive change. And critical making has tended to be more reflexive, obviously more academic, and more limited in its impact. So I want to make that clear from the beginning, that I'm not trying to talk about one as a replacement for the other, but the ways in which they might supplement each other. Interestingly enough, most of the kind of critical making processes that I've engaged in follow a kind of a process that looks a little bit like design thinking. So we typically define a problem space, we engage with some concepts, there is a prompt, a very curated material and linguistic prompt. There's a process of prototyping and a process of reflection. So you can see some kind of similarity to the standard kind of D-school notion of design thinking. But whereas design thinking, again, has had this tendency towards focusing on viability. This is a slide off of IDEO's website, by the way. Viability of business, feasibility of the technology, desirability in terms of market, a more instrumental, more solution-oriented kind of focus. Critical making has tended to be focused more on leveraging design as a way to unpack or open up the problem space. So if design thinking is about solving problems, critical making is about opening up or redefining that problem space rather than actually getting to any kind of solutions. So I'm going to turn now to an example from a workshop I did at Bridgeable this summer, speak very quickly about it, and then move to my conclusions. So these are just some random pictures taken, I think they were actually taken by you, Chris, is that right? So taken by Chris, sent to me in the Japanese airport what feels like yesterday to me, but I think was the day before yesterday maybe, I'm not sure. And this workshop was basically a critical making workshop aimed at exploring some of the typical cognitive models associated with wearables and behavior modification. Technologies like Fitbit or the Apple Watch. And I want to walk through this example. I'm going to move through it very quickly, not to kind of try to teach a form of critical making, but to just highlight some of the ways that it relates to design thinking. So the goal, the problem space that we were engaging in basically had to do with this quote that came from a recent publication, well, a couple years ago, that noted that Fitbit technologies did very little to actually help certain types of youth engage more readily in physical activity. So this was a very large clinical study that was done in the UK, and it basically figured out that Fitbits had very minor impacts, particularly on youth that needed healthcare interventions. So we wanted to explore this, and the starting point for that exploration was basically the idea that the limitation had to do with the focus on individual behavior. That tech, and tech interventions in particular, tend to focus on individual behavior, but strangely enough, research has shown that a focus on individual behavior in terms of behavioral modification tends to not work. That focus on the individual seems to deny the capacity to create longer-term interventions. So within that session, we attempted to design 3 different interventions based on 3 different theories of behavioral change. Ones that are very common in the tech sector in particular, and they are basic, well, I should say 2 of which are common in the tech sector and 1 of which is not. So the first one is this kind of individual model of rational action theory, where all you need to do to create behavioral change is show somebody what their actions are. If you show them what their actions are, they will act rationally and work to change those behaviors to create better health. The second theory is one called social cognitive theory, which basically says, yes, people act rationally, but they need to see how their behavior sits in relationship to other people. So they have this kind of social component to it. And then the last intervention we did was one based on social practice theory, which basically has a different starting point. I built a very basic sketching kind of hardware prototype using an Adafruit Feather, if people are familiar with that platform, a little screen on it, and an OLED ring. This was a very simple microcontroller and battery that was pre-programmed, actually, with code to create a basic UX. So there was a button on it, you could add a good choice, there was a button you could add a bad choice, and the results showed on the screen and the lights lit up on the LED. Now, the purpose of this work, this is, I think, Bill Buxton's slide from some years ago. The purpose of this work was not to create a prototype, actually, as much as it was really to create sketches. Sketches intended to, as Buxton notes, evoke, suggest, explore, question, propose, and provoke, rather than test, rather than resolve. So this was a very different kind of engagement, right? The way the process went, we went through it 3 times, was there was a brief review of one of the relevant behavioral theories, a brief discussion, some brainstorming, building, and a presentation to the group on what had been built. And following each build, I raised an issue from the literature that had to do with the implementation of that particular behavioral theory within other health technologies. And then there was another discussion that was held. There was never any specific attempt to solve those problems. We didn't attempt to go back to the previous prototypes and fix the problems that the literature had noted. Instead, those phases, the objects, and the discussions served as openings for developing alternative ideas and points of view by the participants. So the first one was basically build a device based on the idea that providing knowledge about an individual's good and bad food choices will cause them to change bad behavior, rational action. We talked a little bit about the Fitbit as a primary example of that. And then we talked about the kind of issue, the criticism that's been discovered of that, which is that things like the 10 non-personalized objectives can actually be seen as a disincentive, generating feelings of guilt or lack of ability. Now, the other criticism here is that people don't always act rationally, that in fact, rather than just showing somebody something and then asking them to change their behavior, people's motivations for creating change are more complex. So after that device, they moved on to a second one, which was build a device based on the idea that people change their behavior when they can compare their actions to those of others. This kind of social cognitive theory made, I think, most obviously explicit in something like leaderboards that exist, where you can see your steps in relationship to other people's steps. And my code actually had this hidden function in it, which I didn't tell them about, which was that you could change it into the mode, and then those various little prototypes they were making were communicating with other people's prototypes, and there was some excitement about that. Following that, we then talked a little bit about the issue with that approach, which was that while pressure from competition with peers can be seen as encouraging, it can also be seen as in a negative way, that it can basically disincentivize people to exercise or to share their level of exercise with people. So there was this idea that, in fact, just putting people's work, sort of out of context, but in relation to each other, was seen as problematic. And then in the end of the piece, we talked about the result of this study, which was that these technologies seem to fail in these contexts of use. So we provided an alternative, which was the idea to build a device that took into consideration the connection between food decision-making and other socio-cultural practices. And in order to kind of resource that process, we took a look at this model of the social practice of eating, where we looked at how common understandings were developed, the relationship to practical and tacit skills, and importantly, and I think for a service design crowd in particular, this is key, the material and social infrastructures that are present within those decision-making processes. So the idea that food choice is in fact structured by all sorts of other services, all sorts of different infrastructures, all sorts of other people's behavior and material activities. Not to mention the ways in which food choice is also structured by power relations, by technologies and societies, by the geography in which people live. So all of a sudden, our design space became increasingly complex. It wasn't just about an individual relating to a device, but this larger service ecosystem that had to be taken into consideration. Now, I would love to spend some time talking about the results of that work. They were fascinating objects that were built. They were built out of cardboard using these microcontrollers and these LEDs. There was this amazing wearable. You can see a gentleman wearing it here that made that individual's behavior very apparent to them by glowing green or red directly into their eyeball, depending on their activity. But rather than talk about the objects, I want to talk about some of the insights that I think we got. Now, one insight, and maybe this seems kind of obvious to you, but I think it was less obvious to me, was the reason that we don't see these kinds of health technologies built is because it's extremely difficult to design with social context in mind. Now, you know that. I wish the tech companies knew that a little bit better. It is fascinating, though, that if you look at the literature on behavioral change and modification, that literature emphasizes the fact that individualistic approaches are inadequate, that we have to incorporate more social and contextually based understandings of behavioral change, and yet we still don't tend to build systems that take those kinds of things into consideration. So there's a commonality here that I wanted to highlight to service design and the ways in which it attempts to go up and down the stack of social, infrastructural, and material systems. That services surpass individualistic and contextually specific contexts to kind of be more broad, to include human, non-human organizational structures. And I think that's a kind of a key thing. So why would it be that we continue to build the actual technologies with this individualistic sensibility? Well, I would say that one reason is because the technologies encourage us to do so. They encourage us to slot the user in as another variable. When we attempt to build these technologies, everything gets re-articulated through these forms of procedural logic. And so if you need to build a healthcare technology, the easiest way you can do that is to incorporate the user as an individualistic variable within that overall system. So that's something that has to be resisted. That's a way in which, in fact, that if we were attempting to build a more socially, contextually specific and service-based technology, the material systems may make it more difficult for us to engage in that sophisticated way. But I think the other issue is a question of, this is a big set of terms, methodological individualism. The idea that society is actually, that the social is nothing more than an aggregate of individuals. That society is, in fact, sorry about this long quote, that is basically made up of subjective individual motivations. That social phenomenon can be understood in that disaggregated kind of a way. That class or group dynamics are illusionary or artificial, and that markets and social behavior can be understood as individual atomized groups somehow moving and switching in some sort of generalizable way. Now, I think that, in fact, more than even the code, the limitations of the technology, is one of the reasons why it's so hard to implement technologies that have a broader social mandate. And I have to do a little shout out to Bridgeable's work on the MTA as an example of how difficult it would be to actually build a technology to support this kind of work, given the limitations of methodological individualism and the limitations of the technology, the way in which it pushes us to not take into consideration those much more complex service infrastructures. So I don't offer a solution to those kinds of problems, except to say that that individualistic bias within the technology, within the material structures, and that individualistic bias naturalized within our own ways of thinking about socio-technical systems are problematic. And we have to reveal them, make those kinds of things explicit as part of our design processes, or we run the risk of reincorporating them. So if design thinking focuses us on explicit process, on human-centered, on problem-solving types of capacities, which I think is absolutely fabulous, I think of critical making as refocusing attention on material, structures, on incorporating the material systems in order to feel the pushback. When you try to build the code and the code forces you to engage in these kinds of procedural logics, I think that's a positive move. In a reflexive process that doesn't attempt to solve the problem, but attempts to unpack it and reopen it and see some of those conceptual limitations that make our work more difficult. I think ultimately the difference between critical making and design thinking is not a procedural difference or anything like that. It's simply a matter of where your commitments lie. And I think you can certainly have a design thinking process that incorporates these kinds of commitments, the same type of commitments I was just talking about, but it takes a kind of a deliberate move to make that happen. And in the end, I think it's really about what we want to support, or maybe it's when we want to support it. Is our goal to support a kind of a managerial approach that is really about structuring and engaging and kind of, to some degree, de-skilling design? Or do we want to engage in a design practice that takes into consideration the kind of craziness of the embodied material life of the people around us? Thank you.